Conclusion. The idea of Zion is rooted in the deeper regions of the earth and rises into loftier regions of the air. And neither its deep roots, nor its lofty heights, neither its memory of the past, nor its ideal for the future, both of the self-same texture, must be repudiated. Martin Buber, On Zion, 1952. Chapter 20. The Roots of the Zion Concept. In 1933, Aldous Huxley described Jerusalem as the great slaughterhouse of religions. With tensions ever mounting since then, the summit of the original Zion Hill itself had become the most potentially explosive piece of real estate on earth. A major threat to Jerusalem's security comes from Iraq, the same territory where Syria once lay. Few ideas are more influential in geopolitics today than the concept of Zion, and certainly none is so ancient. The Zion concept predates even the emergence of the monotheism with which it has been closely intertwined, Islam, Christianity, and the oldest of the three, Judaism. It is widely known. Originally, the Zion idea was the belief that Yahweh's carrying presence pervades the hill, called Mount Zion. The Hebrew Bible / the Old Testament says that it was atop this elevation on which the oldest part of Jerusalem grew. King Solomon built the original temple of Yahweh. As one of the Psalms affirms, for the Lord has chosen Zion, desired it for his home. This is my resting place forever. Here I will make my home, for such is my desire. It is a place name that possesses great flexibility. Sometimes the Bible also uses Zion to include the entire city of Jerusalem, which also came to cover more than a single hill, sometimes starting with the Babylonian exile in 586 BC. It employs the word poetically to refer to the entire Hebrew homeland, the former kingdom of Judah and Israel alike. It is Yahweh's devotion to Mount Zion as his dwelling place and the larger region that explains the term holy city and holy land. In the Hebrew Bible, this devotion is no abstract emotion. It has a vividly practical application. Because Yahweh is so strong, says the Bible, he is able to demonstrate his love for the city by protecting it against all enemies. Another psalm, for example, calls the city Yahweh's high stronghold and declares, God is in that city. She shall not be overthrown by earthly forces. In the centuries following the composition of those lines, numerous invaders have conquered Jerusalem and thus discredited the belief in the divine defense. Nonetheless, the sense of holiness that is an integral part of the belief remains strong. For millions of people today, Jerusalem is as much a spiritual capital as it is for the psalmist who wrote, God reigns over the nation. God is seated on his holy throne, that is Zion. Yet, despite the visceral feelings millions have for Zion and the violence that erupts over the question as to which people it properly belongs to, no one really understands this idea. The historical impetus that lies behind this concept of a holy city, has remained unresolved. Just how the writers of the Bible would have arrived at this perception that an omnipotent deity had chosen Zion as his abode would guard it against even the most powerful of attacking foes has been a puzzle. In recent generations, the Zion concept has sometimes been reduced to a functional role as a divine land title, tracing its early development and its original raison d'etre will remind us that it is much more than that. Typical of the vagueness enveloping the idea, even the hill's geographical location is commonly misunderstood. Mount Zion, that appears on many Jerusalem maps and in the city's main guidebooks, is not the original Mount Zion, because the Bible speaks effusively of Zion's great height. The widespread assumption arose many centuries ago that Zion must be the sprawling city's westernmost hill. In fact, of course, the original Zion is the eastern hill. It is there where the glittering dome of the rock now rises that the Bible says Solomon built the first temple to Yahweh. Centuries after the Bible was written, early rabbis amplified the Zion concept. Talmudic literatures make the hill the navel of the world, the place where earth and heaven meet, and where mortals, wherever they happen to be geographically, can route their messages to the divine. It becomes the most important place in the entire cosmos. In the New Testament, too, Jerusalem acquires additional holiness because the Gospels describe Jesus of Nazareth himself, a Jew, as worshiping his divine Father at Jerusalem and as dying and then rising from the dead in Jerusalem, the city that has become a focus of the Christian faith. The city's importance in the history of Jesus, in the story of Jesus, explains why on maps many medieval Christian cartographers placed Jerusalem at the world's geographical center, making it the very pivot of the world, and why the Crusaders struggled to wrest control of it. Some early Christians and Jewish texts also depict Jerusalem as the terrestrial prototype for a heavenly Jerusalem, making the city the axis of a future apocalypse. Like Christians, Muslims accept the Hebrew Bible's depiction of Zion and see later events as adding to its holiness. Although Mecca and Medina have superior status for Muslims, in their tradition it is from Zion's summit that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven and returned. The 1,300-year-old Dome of the Rock commemorates this spot. More recently, the Zion concept has acquired still another dimension. Inspired by the idea of Zion as a homeland and pushed by the rise of virulent anti-Semitism, the Jewish nationalist movement known as Zionism in the late 19th century Europe sought to create a Jewish state in Palestine. With the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948, it succeeded. Despite the term's close association with Jewish patriotism, Zionism can sometimes have a much broader, more universal meaning. A German Jewish religious philosopher, Martin Buber, 1878 to 1965, said the planners of the new state of Israel should remember the roots of the Zion idea. He meant that they should know that Zion involved an entire purpose that transcends nationalism. Buber, who became editor of the Zionist weekly Die Welt in 1901, saw Zionism as having a supranational mission in which the power of the Spirit would replace power politics. It would, he said, spark a new sense of community among nations. In Israel, deeper, lasting solidarity would emerge between Jews and Arabs. A Zion that is based on mutual respect and goodwill among the states, he said, will become the new sanctuary of the nations, and the people who helped achieve that will become the priests in that sanctuary. Buber resided for 17 years in the new state of Israel and served as the first president of Israel's Academy of Arts and Sciences. He died a disappointed man, but it is noteworthy that at his state funeral in Jerusalem, a delegation of the Arab Student Organization placed a wreath on his grave. The first settlement of Jerusalem may have been about 3000 BC, when practical motives rather than religious ones dictated the choice of the site. The Gihon spring was the main source of water for many miles, and the hill above the stream offered a defensible slope on 3 of 4 sides. In the belief in a divine presence looking out for the welfare of his people came later. The Canaanite people who would have lived in Jerusalem prior to the Bible-described conquest of the city by David, circa 1000 BC, had used the word Zion for the hill on which they built their town. The word probably meant fortress or rock. The hill was the home of their deity, Shalem, a West Semitic god. According to the Bible, after the Hebrews took over the hill, they continued to call it Zion, in Hebrew, Zion, by which considered that it was the residence of their own deity, Yahweh. The newcomers also retained the town's venerable name, Jerusalem, pronounced Jerusalem, meaning the foundation of Shalem. Prior to the late 8th century BC, was Mount Zion special? Not particularly. The ancient world was full of sacred hills and mountains. Kor, Mesopotamia, the Sinai Peninsula, as with Mount Sinai and even Cush, witnesses Ammon's sacred mountain. Gebel Barkal at Napata contained various heights that were regarded as cosmic places where the earth touched the divine sphere. In the northern kingdom, such as elevations such as Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, and Mount Gezerim, they could be sacred in either Yahweh's name or in the name of Canaanite gods. Many other peoples had their counterparts to Mount Zion, and Judahites saw Jerusalem's religious status as conforming to a larger international pattern. The people of Judah at the time believed in the existence of many gods, and they would have harbored no illusion about their national deity being the mightiest and his abode therefore the safest. The most in-depth investigation of the origins of Jerusalem's sacred status is by Reynold Clements. His astute 1980 book, Isaiah and the Deliverance of Jerusalem, concludes that Jerusalemites of the 8th century BC would have seen Mount Zion as somewhat special, but not uniquely so, a vital nuance. Describing the people of this period, he says that they held special beliefs that the presence of Yahweh in the sanctuary temple there, the inhabitants of Jerusalem were certainly encouraged to believe that their God would protect them in a time of war and bless them in a time of peace and prosperity. Yet these ideas were fundamental elements in almost all cult traditions of the ancient Orient. There is little to indicate that Jerusalem was especially unique in that regard. If we had fuller information about the ancient cults of Bethel, Shechem, and elsewhere, Bethel and Shechem being centers of worship of Yahweh in the North Kingdoms, we would no doubt find that there were many features in which they were closely similar to that of Jerusalem. The professor at King's College, University of London, who based his research mostly on biblical texts, adds, there is no reason why we should be especially surprised, therefore, that the old Jerusalem cultus, i.e. organized religious practices, was linked with the mythology about a sacred mountain, nor is it all a surprise that the citizens of Jerusalem believed that their God would guard and protect them in a time of war, since it must have been one of the most deeply embedded of all early man's religious convictions. In the generations prior to 701, then, there is little to suggest the Hebrews would have seen Jerusalem as more deserving of divine protection than other Hebrew cities. Starting in 738 BC, the generation of people in the Hebrew, Philistine, and Phoenician kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean region lived in a profound fear. 8 times over a period of 37 years, Assyria, history's first military state, had dispatched armies to the region to conquer its people, and when they dared rebel, punished them by ravaging the land. 5 of these onslaughts struck a Hebrew territory. One of them, in 720, annihilated the restive vassal state of Israel. In the thinking of the people of the time, military conflicts always had a strong religious dimension. If Assyria had so easily bested other kingdoms by force, it meant that its main deity, Ashur, was vastly stronger than the national gods of the defeated peoples, including Yahweh, Israel's national god. In 701, the dynamic changed. The army of Ashur was on the verge of obliterating the only remaining Hebrew kingdom, tiny Judah, when a Cushite-led army from Egypt drove the invader from the gates of Jerusalem and saved the nation. The 11th hour rescue enabled Judah to survive another 115 years, a vital period in which it was able to nurse itself back to economic and demographic health. It is also during this grace period that Yahwehism, the local variant of the polytheism that thrived in the region, would greatly develop and begin a process of theological reflection that would continue to ripen during and after the exile. The stimulus of much of this reflection had been the rescue of 701. The event cried out for religious explanation. How had Yahweh overpowered the supposedly invincible Ashur, and why? For several generations, Judahites pondered these questions. The answers they found have gone far towards defining the dominant religious tradition of the West. Yahweh was a great beneficiary of the rescue. Was a great beneficiary of the rescue. Judahites interpreted the outcome of the Assyrian invasion as demonstrating that their national deity was mightier than Ashur, that Yahweh had saved Jerusalem and not any other city, including Samaria, the relatively grand Israelite capital which the Assyrians had besieged before destroying, meant that he had a special love for Jerusalem and its people. It would take 1 or 2 centuries for this perception to mature, but eventually Yahweh would be seen as a deity who was indeed so powerful that his realm could not be confined to one nation, but could only be universal. Indeed, later generations would see Jerusalem's miraculous revival as the deliverance through which Yahweh had demonstrated his commitment to them. From this grew a confidence among the Hebrews that they were the deity's chosen people, an identity to which eventually many Christians and Muslims would see themselves as heirs. The deliverance also laid the groundwork for what has become one of the modern world's most politically charged ideas, the concept of Zion, closely related to the idea of election. It is in biblical texts that originate after 701 that we find a new appreciation of Zion, a conviction that Yahweh has revealed his love for the city by saving it from an Assyrian army under the personal command of the mighty emperor Sennacherib. Jerusalem became to be seen as forever impregnable. Yahweh was now in a position to offer such a guarantee. Having triumphed over Ashur, the powerhouse in Assyria's pantheon, Yahweh was no longer a minor deity, but an indomitable one. Yahweh's proven prowess over Assyria becomes, as Clements puts it, the basis for a larger and more universal hope that the deity will always protect Zion from all nations. In another passage of the book of Isaiah that deal with a hypothetical future, Yahweh chases away the threatening nations as easily as the wind blows dust. As the character of the Hebrew Godhead changes in response to the Assyrian threat, as to the Assyrian retreats, so did that of his dwelling place, Jerusalem. It was in this post-701 period that the worship of Yahweh may have become centralized in Jerusalem, institutionally anchoring the city's religious importance. This belief in the city's providential safety became almost dogma. Scholars call it the doctrine of Jerusalem's inviolability. This belief, reflected in many biblical passages, is the key step in Jerusalem's ascension to the holy status that it possesses today. Like most other experts on the period, Chaim Tadmor argues that the concept of the inviolability of Jerusalem stemmed from the outcome of the siege of 701. He explains, the fact that Sennacherib and his huge army could devastate most of Judah but not take its capital was considered by the following generation as indeed a miracle. Until then, the Assyrian military machine had seemed invincible, crushing every Western rebel, annexing its territory, and exiling its people. The example a few years earlier of the annihilation of Israel, militarily stronger than Judah, and also a worshiper of Yahweh, added to the city's extraordinary aura. As Tadmor's colleagues at the Hebrew University, Sarah Jaffet, puts it, Sennacherib's retreat showed that Jerusalem had a unique position in the earthly world. It was indestructible, for the Lord's presence and special grace protected it from all evil. The argument that Jerusalem's survival in 701 gave enormous impetus to the Zion concept is eminently logical and very widely accepted. Where I differ, however, is on the cause of that survival. Clements, for one, argues that Hezekiah would have surrendered the city and mollified Sennacherib with a large indemnity. That makes no sense. A banal payoff to the Assyrians would not have inspired a psalm to say that in Mount Zion's citadel God has shown himself a sure defense. Who makes attacking kings flee in panic? As well, in theological terms, such a capitulation would imply that Ashur had cowed Jerusalemites, and hence that the city's survival, in effect, sprang from infidelity to Yahweh.
May I have your attention, please? McKelton Library will be closing for all users in 30 minutes. There will be no late-night study. Thank you.
The doctrine of inviolability would not crystallize overnight. It probably took the better part of the ensuing century. The deliverance was also seen as a demonstration of another of Yahweh's great loyalties, this one political. Not only would Yahweh always protect his city, but he would also protect David's dynasty and never bless any other aspirants to the throne. In the B2 account, which may have been written a generation or more after Josiah's time, Yahweh announces that he will defend Jerusalem for the sake of my servant David. The deity's rescue of David's descendant Hezekiah and from Sennacherib then was presented as proof of the solemnity of Yahweh's promise to David in the Deuteronomistic history that his descendants would rule forever. A promise known as the Davidic covenant. As distinct from the covenant, The blessing that Yahweh gives to the city of David meshes closely to the blessing that he grants to the family of David. One of the lessons in the Bible's story of the deliverance, Clements notes, is that the salvation of Israel is assured through the Davidic dynasty. But why should anyone today care about either the doctrine of Jerusalem's inviolability or the Davidic covenant? Didn't both concepts soon prove to be groundless? Yes and no. Within a few decades of the doctrine's formulation, Babylon's conquest of Jerusalem made it obvious that Yahweh's protection was not absolute. As well, Yahweh's promise to David that his descendants will rule in perpetuity proved to be inaccurate. After Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, no member of David's line ever again became monarch. Yet, remarkably, Judah's downfall discredited neither idea. In trying to reconcile the collapse of both Jerusalem and the house of David with their own theology, Hebrew thinkers during their exile decided that Yahweh's love for both the city and David's line had to be conditional. That is, Yahweh's loyalty depended upon the chosen people's loyalty to him. If God's people accepted the rule of their divine overlord, they would prosper. If their fealty to him weakened, they would be punished. The Deuteronomic theology explains why Deuteronomistic history blames Judah's destruction on ungodly, cruel policies of King Manasseh. Hezekiah's son, even though the scapegoat's reign had ended more than half a century before. The importance of this Deuteronomic idea in Western thought is hard to overstate. For 2.5 millennia, it has provided believers with an incentive system for respecting religion and for practicing good behavior. Indeed, through the Ten Commandments and other rules, it has greatly helped to define good. To appreciate this approach's revolutionary impact, recall that the Deuteronomic school replaced an old system of currying favor by means of making sacrifice to the gods or behaving in other ways that were quite distinct from ethics. In an indirect but nonetheless significant manner, the new way evolved from the deliverance. And Clements puts it, the stimulus for the rise of the Deuteronomic school was the tension between the high optimism of the Zion Davidic theology as it evolved from the deliverance and the military setbacks that Judah suffered starting about a century later, culminating in Babylon's destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Several centuries after the exile, in the period of Deuteronomy, the doctrine of inviolability would take on an eschatological dimension. A late addition to the book of Zechariah says that on that day all the nations of the earth attack Jerusalem. Yahweh will destroy them all, shielding the city's inhabitants while at the same time cleansing them of sin and impurity. Later still, in the 1st century AD, the New Testament book of Revelation further elevated Jerusalem's mystical standing. At the end of the world, this apocalyptic text foresees the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven from God. Jerusalem, says Revelation, will be a shining city made of pure gold, clear as glass, with the glory of God as its light, so that the nations would walk by its light, and the kings of the earth would bring their glory into it, and nothing unclean will enter it. Because of our incomplete knowledge of Jerusalem's religious reputation prior to Sennacherib's invasion, caution is in order. Rather than suggest that the survival of 701 was necessarily the genesis of the idea of the city's absolute divine protection, I am saying that this survival represents the major impetus to the flowering of that idea. Clements himself allows that prior to Sennacherib's withdrawal, there may have been a sense that a relatively weak Yahweh would do what he could in the face of Assyria's high-powered deity. The deliverance does not necessarily deserve all the credit for giving Jerusalem an aura of holiness, but it does merit the lion's share. Sennacherib's retreat was one of the great turning points in recorded history because if his army had destroyed Jerusalem, there would have been no Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. But the deliverance did more than enable those religions to exist. It also affected their content, particularly in the case of Judaism and Christianity. The attribution of supreme holiness to Zion, the concept of power and character of the Godhead, and the identity of the chosen people are all so significant to a significant degree, traceable to early efforts to explain the why of Sennacherib's withdrawal, and later attempts to reconcile the theological first impression of the marvelous event to the calamitous reality that ensued in 586 BC, helped to establish a sense of morality that has influenced the daily conduct of billions of people. What interested Martin Buber? What interested Martin Buber was not the Zion concept's propriety aspect so much as the ecumenical dimension. A biblical basis exists for that view. In one of its most uplifting passages on Zion, the Bible promises that at some future time all nations shall stream to it. The text goes on to say that many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to Zion, for the Lord, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, that he may teach us his ways. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, that the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." While those lines receive little attention, it is immediately after them that we encounter the celebrated verse that the nations shall beat their swords into plowshares, and nation shall not lift sword against nation. One of the biblical passages that peace movements in various countries use most frequently, in other words, originates in the specific context of the Zion concept. The passage is from the book of Isaiah. It would have been composed sometime after the prophet's lifetime, when Judahites were assessing implications of the crisis of 701. This book's examination of the crisis from a historical perspective reveals that it was not, as most scholars suppose, mere microbes that, by infecting Sennacherib's army with disease, miraculously saved Jerusalem, and in effect permitted the survival of the Hebrew people and led to the flowering of the Zion concept. Nor was it, as others speculate, by some other crisis because some other crisis distracted the attackers' attention, or because Jerusalemites meekly surrendered. None of those three theoretical explanations for the deliverance has any logical connection to the Zion concept's intrinsic majesty. Rather, the factual explanation advanced here is fully consistent with the book of Isaiah's depiction of Zion's ultimate character as international, as bringing nations together. If the Zion concept is ultimately ecumenical, so is the historical event that contributed so much to the concept. Jerusalem owed its survival to an alliance of people of different cultures: Judahites, Egyptians, Cushites, and quite possibly other sub-Saharan peoples with ties to the Cushite kingdom, either as subjects or allies. The ramifications of the conflict of 701 were not so positive for the Cushites. To be sure, their own performance that summer must be one of the great stories of military heroism. That we lack adequate record of their feat is no reason not to attempt to reconstruct its outlines. The overriding preoccupation of the two Cushite pharaohs, Shebako and his son Chpt, who probably ruled in a co-regency arrangement during these crisis years, was to save the Nile Valley from Assyrian invasion. Yet, after hearing desperate pleas from Hezekiah's emissaries to save Judah, Cushites departed from the prudent strategy that they had used at least twice before, of waiting for the Assyrians to reach the Egyptian border before confronting them. Deploying large forces in Judah against Sennacherib represented a huge gamble. If those forces lost and suffered important casualties, Assyria could conquer the Nile Valley with little resistance. If they won, Egypt and Cush might keep Judah and adjacent kingdoms free of Assyrian domination indefinitely, and win back trade access to markets in the eastern Mediterranean. The interventionist strategy appears to have had two prongs. The first took advantage of Cush's celebrated equine prowess. Shebako and Chpt sent a small, fast-traveling unit composed of mostly charioterie and cavalry to confront Sennacherib. The Cushite Egypt contingent achieved success by slowing Sennacherib's advance and thus delaying his assault on Jerusalem and the completion of his conquest of Judah. This gave time for the pharaoh to prepare the other prong, a larger, slow-moving force composed mostly of foot soldiers and militia, perhaps mobilized from as far away as Cush and led by Chpt's young cousin, Prince Taharka. One can imagine the sense of desperation and physical strain as the army traveled more than 1,000 miles through Cush, Upper and Lower Egypt, and then another 300 miles east of the Nile across the grueling Sinai Desert under the sun to meet a foe that was more experienced and better equipped than it itself. An army that was strong, demonstrably cruel, and insatiably power-hungry, as antiquity had produced to that time. Catching Sennacherib flat-footed and out of position, Taharka's army was able to liberate Jerusalem from siege and free the region from Assyrian imperialism for a generation, but only a generation. Cush and its allies within Egypt would pay dearly for their success. In 679, Sennacherib's son and successor Ashurhardan stormed back into Judah and its neighbors, and a few years later, when Taharka was the pharaoh, his fate and that of his people became one of the great tragedies of history. Ashurhardan describes his invasion of Egypt in 671 in these chilling, vindictive terms. I fought daily, without interruption, very bloody battles against Taharka, king of Egypt and Cush, the one accursed by the great gods. 5 times I hit him with the point of my arrow, inflicting wounds from which he should not recover. The victorious king goes on to explain what happened after he captured Taharka's palace at Memphis. I destroyed it, tore down its walls, and burnt it down. His queen, the woman of his palace, Ush-Anahuru, his heir apparent, his other children, his possessions, horses, large and small cattle, beyond counting, I carried as booty to Assyria. All Cushites had deported from Egypt, leaving not even one to do homage to me. Yet, the severely injured Taharka did not die. He somehow recovered and defended Egypt against further Assyrian onslaughts for another 7 years before dying at age 56. Impatient to end Cush's dogged hold on Egyptian territory and on many native Egyptian political loyalties, in 663, a new Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, marched against the new Cushite pharaoh Tanwetamani, Chpt's younger brother. The pharaoh retreated south to the great fortified city of Thebes, the religious and political capital of Upper Egypt. Because Thebes was the home of their great deity Ammon, much as Jerusalem was that of Yahweh, successive Cushite pharaohs had restored many of the city's neglected greater monuments and temples and built new ones. Once again, Thebes had become storied throughout the Western world for its grandeur, beauty, and wealth. Upon the approach of Ashurbanipal's army, Tanwetamani left Thebes, perhaps to spare the city from a destructive all-out battle, and retreated southward again. Ashurbanipal describes what happened next. I myself conquered this town completely. From Thebes I carried away booty, heavy and beyond counting, silver, gold, precious stones, his entire personal possessions, linen garments with multicolored trimmings, fine horses, certain inhabitants, male and female. I pulled 2 high obelisks made of shining bronze, and weight of which was 2,500 talents. Standing at the door of the temple, and took them to Assyria. Thus I carried off from Thebes heavy booty beyond counting. I made Egypt and Cush feel my weapons bitterly and celebrated my triumph. The gusto with which Assyria carried out these invasions and the manner in which Ashurhardan glories in the severe injuries that Taharka himself suffered just testifies to an unusual grudge towards the Cushites. This frame of mind has puzzled historians. T.G.H. James, for one, points out that the enmity displayed by the Assyrian kings, directed particularly at Taharka, personally suggests that something more than simple imperial purposes prompted the successive Assyrian invasions of Egypt. James does not offer a rationale for the punishing fury with which Assyria pursued Taharqa and his people, but with our new grasp of the Cushite role in the event of 701, we can understand the depth of the humiliation that Assyria sought to avenge. For enabling Hebrew society to survive, Taharqa, his cousin Chpt, and his uncle Shabako are every bit as worthy of recognition as the celebrated Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, who liberated the Hebrews from their Babylonian captivity in 538 BC and wrestled them and resettled them in the new Persian province of Judea. The possibility concerns me that some browsers looking at this book's concluding chapter may innocently draw the inference that unsympathetic writers of the Hebrew Bible had concealed the fact that Africans saved Jerusalem. That would simply create resentment and considerably add to strains in North America between blacks and Jews, where there is no cause. The point is worth restating. The Bible has not deleted the Cushite role. The original biblical narrative, B1, perhaps written within about half a century of the deliverance, gave the credit of Sennacherib's withdrawal to the Cushites. The subsequent account, B2, written considerably later, greatly downplayed the Cushite role without erasing it. Careful readers can still see the role. The reason for this change in the story had nothing to do with the Cushites. One reason was contemporary Egypt. It had come under the control of a new government that was the enemy of the Cushites and most Hebrews. The principal reason for obscuring Cushite parts, that obscuring Cushite part, however, was religious, a desire to give greater glory to Yahweh and to show that loyalty to Him could bring deliverance. Outside the particular context of 701, the Hebrew Bible is in fact praises Cushites, treating them as pious exceptions in a pagan world, a people who are drawn to worship of the Hebrews' own deity, Yahweh. One of the most recent scholars to have perceived this is the French philosopher and historian Ernest Renan. It is remarkable, he writes in his History of People of Israel, that the Ethiopian, i.e. Cushites, are always represented by the prophets as having a propensity for the worship of Yahweh, and that they, for this reason, were treated more favorably than the other Goyim nations. The timing of this properly generous insight is significant. Renan, 1823 to 1892, was a member of the last European generation to have reached maturity prior to the colonization of Africa. If the Cushite achievement of 701 is unknown to us today, it does not reflect on the integrity of biblical writers. Rather, it reflects on that of Western scholarship beginning in the late 19th century when the Western imperialist adventure in Africa got underway. As the invasion went into higher gear, it relied heavily on the idea that if one's own civilization dominates another people, they must be inherently inferior. Their history, accordingly, must be worthless. The disdainful outlook has stuck. Ignoring all evidence to the contrary, most leading biblical scholars and Egyptologists claim to this day that the Hebrew Bible is contemptuous of the Cushites, and that foreign policy and military performance, and that their foreign policy and military performance were pitiable. In its telling of the invasion of 701, the Hebrew Bible makes it very clear that Jerusalem was unexpectedly saved, and that the survivors and their descendants were filled with gratitude. The Hebrews had an acute understanding that salvation is too important to take for granted, and they reshaped their theology to account for it. In the invasion story final version, the introduction of an angel as an agent of salvation symbolizes a caring deity who looked out for his people. Nothing in this reconstruction of the events of 701 would serve to diminish either the deity's stature or Jerusalem's holiness. On the contrary, the construction serves to flesh out the origin of the city's holy status, and to show that if Yahweh intervened to save the city, the deity did so not by acting vertically through an angel, but horizontally through people. It is a story that impels us to stand back and reflect that the original cause of Jerusalem's specialness has less to do with religious particularity than with universalism. It is a story that chimes neatly with Martin Buber's understanding of what the Zion concept stands for, a kind of supranational sense of fellowship, of good struggling valiantly for survival. From the perspectives of realism, it is not more credible that the rescue came from humans rather than an angel. From the perspective of religion, is the arrival of a friendly foreign army not more an uplifting explanation than those of secular theories that hold that the reason of the city's deliverance was an abject capitulation by the city's defenders, or mere germs? After all, a central tenet of all three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike, is that the people should help each other. End of the Rescue of Jerusalem.